So, hello everyone. This is Sheila Pearl, the Love Doctor. And we are welcoming back today Brian Baird, who was my very first guest for this podcast. Let's talk about making love better. And it so happens that Brian and I were having dinner the other night, and we got on the subject of something probably near and dear to many of our hearts for many reasons, and that is the subject of unconditional love. And he apparently had thrown out the idea about unconditional love on social media. And there ensued a conversation on social media in which many people were saying, yes, 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 unconditional love, yes. And then someone said, no way, not possible. Maybe with your kids, I'm not so sure. And that caused us to rethink the whole question. Is it really possible to love unconditionally, knowing us as we do, knowing human beings as we do, knowing we're all perfectly imperfect? So, Brian, I want to welcome you back today for this conversation and for you to perhaps share some of your thoughts that came from that post on social media that turned into a thread of comments that for both of us is very, very interesting. So, what do you think? Is it possible?
Well, let's start with why I put the question out there. I, um, I, somebody I really care about, who I have not talked to in a while, and during part of our journey, it was declared that she did not believe in unconditional love, and it took me back. It actually shook me because all the work that we do was kind of in line with. I want to say kind of. I shouldn't say catching words, right? It was in line with the notion that deep down inside, that is part of the arc of our journey, is to reveal and experience and perhaps sustain as much as possible this energy of unconditional love. And I had, at that point when that statement was being made, I had already felt it. Like the ability for me to have people in my life that it might not even really like, I can still actually love them without concern for any kind of connection, response, reaction, payback, pay it forward. I didn't have any of those. I can just love that person. And actually, when I feel like just talking about it, I can actually feel it coming from inside of me, this ability to have that kind of love. and
And yet, was that always so?
No, 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 not by any means. I've never had that experience before. I shouldn't say never, but in my early arcs of my journey, no. I'd say I was well into my 50s before that was something that I was able to identify and feel and even nourishing the concept of unconditional love by taking somebody who maybe has even recently either attempted to or exercised injury upon me, and still just go, I still love you. It's how you show up isn't changing how I feel. Now, from the human frame, I'm still insulted, hurt, injured, whatever the case may be. Yet I can still feel like when I just think about the most recent injury of sorts like that, I go, oh my gosh, I can feel the glow. That's the only way I can describe it. Kind of a glow, and I just say, I love you. I love you. And it goes with that. So for me, I'm kind of a newbie at this discussion. I was wondering, Sheila, even though you and I talked about me being on the show to talk about the subject, this is your subject matter expertise. Would it be okay if we turned the tables of your show and I interviewed you on your own show?
Sure. Why don't we do that? I mean, that's a novel idea, and absolutely. Well, you can interview me, but I can continue to interview you as well.
Okay.
In other words, it's all about the dynamic of the conversation, which we learned with the first two episodes that we're very interactive, and we give and receive quite freely and generously. So let's go for it. You go ahead and interview me. It's my pleasure to be on the receiving end of your questions.
Well, in our conversations, and I was when we had talked about in even my previous appearance on your podcast is that you and I have known each other, and we're close to the 15-year mark, if not past that somehow. And I remember our meetings. I would actually say in some ways fond of it. I remember our meetings where you treated me very gingerly, because I think you recognized that I had a distance to go before I could maybe do the real walk. I was more capable of talking about things, but necessarily really leaning in on. Even having this kind of conversation would have not happened 15 plus years ago. So, excuse me. So, what I witnessed in my memory now, what I witnessed was your ability to show up with love, without regard for whether or not I was appearing authentically or supportively in your journey. And it's one of the reasons why I think we're still connected, because there was no, one of the things about unconditional love is your ability to suspend judgment.
That's key. That's key. That is key.
Expressing compassion. So, so this is why I know you have a longer path on this topic than me, which is why I thought we should talk to you about it. Because it's as much as I can talk about the experience, and I even guide some of my clients into this, at least the idea that this exists. This is your baby, so to speak, your relationship and bereavement, both of which touch on unconditional love in some extraordinary arcs or in extraordinary ways. So I wanted to know from you when you first recognized the aspect of unconditional love and how it showed up for you.
Well, I wasn't expecting you to ask me that specific question. Of course,
I throw hard balls, right?
I'm frankly not sure when, except let me just say, I have been a mother for a very brief period of time in my young life. I gave birth to one child only, who lived only 8 months. And that shook my world. So, and since then, that's been over 55 years ago. Since then, I have sought to find a way to fill that emptiness with a need to nurture and to be that mother. And now I have all kinds of soul children, people who say to me, I feel like you're my mother. Can I adopt you? This past Mother's Day, one of my soul sons took me out to dinner, and we just had a wonderful time. And he calls me Mama Sheila. And I reference that because I think from the time I was, in my early 20s and a young mother, and then having tragically lost my child, it kind of threw me into a particular place that maybe not many people are thrown into until later, when they're forced by other kinds of circumstances to face their demons, to face their resistance to loving unconditionally. And because I wanted so desperately, so deeply to find a way to use myself as that nurturing human being, I probably focused on the issue of loving and loving unconditionally much earlier in my life. And it was also at the same time that I was delving into issues of helping others, which was my goal. And one of the psychologists and authors, I really consider him a philosopher as well, was Erich Fromm, who wrote that wonderful book, which I referenced in our first episode together, Brian, where Erich Fromm talks about how loving is an attitude. Love is an attitude. And it's a state of being, and it's a reflection of your special uniqueness. And I really took that to heart from a very young age and development in my development as an adult, and continued to take that very seriously in terms of love being an attitude, recognizing that love was something I could choose to be regardless of the relationship. In other words, love was not about an agreement or a quid pro quo between me and another person. It was actually an attitude that I could adopt. And I really delved into that idea of love being about being non-judgmental, which to me is where the unconditional piece of it comes. So, and from a very early age, because I was delving into it, I began to experience that you cannot have love if there's judgment. And if you have a transactional attitude about love, then it's not love. In other words, if you give me this, I'll give you that. If you eat my food, I'll love you. If you agree with me, I love you. And I think I was sensitized to that notion early on when my father would rant and rave, pound the table if anyone disagreed with him. And I learned to fear that and also abhor that, and to see that what my father was doing with his behavior towards us and my mother was creating an idea of what the rules were for him in his world. And in his world, if you loved him, he would love you. If you liked him, he would like you. If you agree with him, he would like you. If you cross him or if you do something he didn't like, you were out of the picture. So at an early age, he and my parents were divorced when I was 10. At an early age, he forced the issue of where my brother and I wanted to live. And I'm not quite sure how and why the courts did this or allowed it, but he took us to court and he asked us in front of the judge to tell the judge whether or not we wanted to live with mommy or daddy. And when I said, I want to live with mommy, I love daddy, but I want to live with mommy, my father, who did not understand what unconditional love was. He only understood the quid pro quo. He understood only the transactional aspect. He closed the door emotionally and also literally on my brother and me. And so from a very early age and stage of my life, I learned what love was and what love wasn't. And I did everything in my power to strive to be loving and to attract others to me, people who were loving. And my mother was one of these people who would always say to me, Sheila, you can differ with people, but you don't have to be disagreeable. Just because people don't agree with you doesn't mean you can't love them. And my mother from an early age taught me the value of being non-judgmental. On the other hand, my father was very bigoted. And in fact, my grandfather, I learned later, had been a member of the KKK. So certain people were in and certain people were out. So certain people he judged to be bad, others good. My mother taught me from a very early age that we're all God's children and we all deserve love, not judgment. So I think I had a leg up. I think I had, an advantage from perhaps, some examples of what love wasn't and what love was. And then at the age of 22, to have gotten pregnant and gave birth to my daughter and then her tragically dying from a heart disease nobody knew she had. I was shocked into, with a dramatic situation, I was shocked into really thinking much more deeply and much more quickly about what love is and what it isn't.
You
And
had
so
this experience that could have broken you.
it could have. But
And because, we have this exercise that we hear people talking about is the only unconditional love is the love of a parent for a child. And I will argue I've seen plenty of parent-child relationships where it's not unconditional. There's a lot, good grades and these other expectations that can actually create parental withdrawal or other kinds of behaviors that turn out to be non-positive. In your case, you had this thing where you had a child who you actually were at whatever the spectrum is of this discussion about unconditional love, you had that unconditional love for somebody who was with you only for 8 months breathing, and of course the previous 9 months there. So you had an expression you used that you had a hole to fill, and I thought, okay, that's the grief, right? Or at least that's how it will, what that hole looks like in many cases. So tell me a little bit about, if you don't mind, the journey that this healing from this grief connected the dots to unconditional love for you.
Well, the reason I told you the story of my father and mother, right? We had night and day. We had the example of what love wasn't and the example of what love was. And so that predated my having my child by 10 years. And so, from an early age, even before I became a mother, I was sensitized to and aware of the difference between what love is and what isn't. Because my mother was an example of unconditional love. My mother and grandmother both gave me the living, breathing example of unconditional love. My father was the opposite, right? So I became deeply interested in how to foster that in all of my relationships and how to be an instrument of nurturing, which is one of the reasons I went into the work that I do now. Um, and that empty space was more than just the simple loss of my child. It was also having had that child, having experienced being mommy for a very short period of time, created this open, empty space which needed to be expanded and filled in a very special way. In other words, I had a sense of my special uniqueness. I had a sense of my destiny, and I wasn't quite sure how that was going
Well,
to.
that's interesting, because before you had this phrase that you used, you had a hole to fill, but you've relabeled this as something that you needed to expand. And and I think that right there was unconditional love for self, right? You have this ability to recognize that there is trauma in losing somebody as a human being in our lives. Yet somehow or other you were able to reach beneath the core of our human frame and realize there was a larger picture to this thing that would be part of your healing process from that thing you initially called a whole. And now you're talking about it as the entire process was an opportunity for you to become larger than you were already in your knowledge base, heart-wise and head-wise, right?
That's right. That's right. So somehow instinctively, partly because I had been introduced to the the opposite of what love is and to the reality of what love is, so that I was able to understand that I had that capacity in me. I understood that also others had that capacity in them, and they might also be subjected to parenting such as my father, or other experiences with other people that were close to them, such as my father, or have other relationships that were significant, other relationships in which they were in abusive relationships, which was all about, if you do what I want, I'll be nice to you. If you don't, I'll beat the shit out of you, right?
Right.
So I began to notice that everywhere I looked, I could see the dichotomy, I could see the polarity, I could see that so many people were raised not having a clue what unconditional love could be about. So they could only understand the quid pro quo. They could only understand, if you do this, I will love you. If I do this, I will get love, and I will get acceptance. And that's often the way human beings grow until they get to a point in their 50s, like you mentioned, where for whatever reason you were awakened. You became more keenly aware of what this human life is really all about. And it's all about finding ways to stop resisting all the things that we want to run away from. Life is really all about letting go of the barriers and letting go of the fear of feeling anything in particular, because we're designed to actually feel everything, but we're also designed to be loving. We're not designed to be judgmental. And yet there is a part of our psyche that is wired for that. But judgment and love do not go together. I said to you in our previous conversation, where judgment enters, love goes on vacation.
That's so profound in the sense that there are three things I'm noticing in this thing. It's not just judgment, but need, I should say. So judgment, need, and transaction are three words that typify what we often call love, yet they all typify what I'm calling the opposite of. In fact, the comment I put on Facebook, which spearheaded this conversation, is if your love is connected to need, it is need, not love. That so it's back to that transactional thing. That's you are filling my hole. My love is about filling my holes, and not necessarily about expanding so that I don't have those holes. And and that's where I came into the process of like looking in as I was going through and I had a pretty accelerated development path because I was rubber banded to 50 some odd years of no learning at this level. So I went through to me personally, it seems like it was just yesterday that all these things, even though it's been a few years now, it's just like just yesterday that some of the stuff became so clear to me about the human condition and my own place in the human condition. And when I look back on all the times where love for me was based on I need you, I need something from you, or I need to maybe do something about you or to you, like judge you. When I had those kinds of needs that were there, then today I can say clearly that I was putting conditions on this thing, and therefore I argue it's not even real love. It's need, and so my question is can you recognize a path to unconditional love? Does anybody know about this? Can they feel it? Some people would yell out yes, and other people would say nope, not possible.
Well, like a couple of people that you told me in that thread commented, no way, Jose, except maybe with my children.
Right.
But you and I know from our experience with our own parents, a certain parent, certain father, mother, whichever one, was that in our experience in growing up, we had conditions.
Mm-hmm.
We experienced judgment. We experienced pushback if we didn't do what our parents wanted us to do. So I would say most people that I see now in my practice, I see because in their now important intimate relationships, they are in the midst of being triggered. And I often say, your trigger triggers my trigger kind of thing.
Right.
They're in the midst of being triggered by their partners with the kinds of things that make them feel that they're unseen, unheard, and therefore not loved. Or they're not getting what they need from their partner. So they're angry, disappointed, sometimes rageful that they're not getting what they feel they must have in order to be happy. And yet, the human condition is constantly inviting us to heal that wound that constantly gets triggered so that we can own our own psyche, we can own our own emotions, so that I can say to you, you don't make me mad. You don't, you don't abuse me. If you do abuse me, I'm allowing it. And the question is how and why.
So doesn't this speak to the property of that we are scheduled, so to speak, as we are in this journey to learn specific things, and even if it takes us a long time to learn them, our relationships are usually the tools by which we get the best exposure to those lessons.
Our relationships are the fundamental tools. We cannot experience ourselves without being in relationship with others. And the extent to which those relationships nurture us, that gives us a foundation. To the extent they challenge us, that gives us an exercise.
So what would be, I don't want to, obviously, when people are working with you as a client, it's not a half-hour thing. So, and with some of the time that we have today, I was wondering if you can give people insight into what that journey looks like from the moment somebody points out to you, as somebody who's a guide like yourself in the practice that you do, to help them see that they have been inviting, even though it's maybe in many ways, I argue it's not, they're not necessarily directly responsible in terms of a conscious action to make these things happen. Yet, because that's the lesson that they need to learn, they keep either picking relationships that bring these things, or in the same relationship, it cycles through and through until it becomes clear that that was what they were supposed to learn from that person. And so the reason why I'm making this long arc of a discussion here is it seems to me that in many ways, the issue here is that until I'm leaning in on my own self-love unconditionally or transaction free, like I'm not looking for something for myself, that I'm going to resist the lessons. It's that the ability for me to literally open my heart to lessons is what's going to change my relationships or the history of my relationships so the patterns don't repeat. And I was wondering what you might be able to enlighten us with that makes that easier. Or just possible.
Or possible, right? First of all, I've learned that with most people who fall in love, who are attracted to someone else, there is something unconscious and mystical or mysterious in that connection. In other words, we're not just attracted to their blue eyes or brown hair or physique or the way they smell, although that, you know, that those are factors that account for attraction. But there's another level of attraction which most of us have when we're attracted to someone as a partner. And that something has something to do with kind of like a life contract. Now, that relationship may not last forever. It may be a relationship that's pivotal. It might be a relationship that takes us to another relationship for another stage in our development. But the fact is, we're often attracted to people, usually in romantic situations, but not always, who give us an experience of ourselves that we need to have that wakes us up. Now, sometimes it can be the kind of relationship I had with my mother, which was a healing balm. She gave me the relationship with myself in which I felt I was beautiful and I could do anything I wanted and I felt accepted. And then I had a relationship with someone like my father who gave me the experience that I was a throwaway, I was disposable, and I was not valuable, and I was not worthy of being loved. So you had that polarity, that disparity. And so, you know, when we meet our partners, for instance, when I met my husband, it was almost like I met the opposite of my husband, and yet the opposite of my father, and yet my husband was much older. So there was something in that relationship I was attracted to, which I needed at that time in my life, because my husband, like my mother, saw me as only beautiful, only wonderful, only everything he ever wanted. And so, you know, I apparently needed that in my life. So he gave me a grounding. He gave me a comfort. Fast forward, after my husband passed, I met someone who was another test for me. He would often ignore me. He would often not respond to me. I took it very personally, and he would poke me, and he triggered me. And he often come in and would say, "Babe, why do you take me so personally?" And so that relationship was another kind of test or lesson for me, in which I began to understand the nature of triggers, the nature of anyone who would annoy me, anybody who would poke me, would be something I needed to heal. So any relationship that you and I have, Brian, that has been a source of, let's just say, conflict, is something that very often, if we can heal that, we can maintain that relationship. and have something very beautiful, or the relationship itself teaches us what that conflict is about so we can heal and move on to another relationship that serves us in our lives. Uh, all of life, every relationship we have is some form of mirror.
Well, it's interesting too. You point out that the relationship could change and become something beautiful, or we change and perhaps we dissolve the relationship. And I'm going to offer just a real quick insight to the fact that my ex-wife and I, we are no longer marriage partner material, yet we've grown to another level. You know, we're friends of. We've gone to dinner together. It's not like we go. Actually, it's not true. I've even vacationed a little bit with her, just because there were outings involving my daughter and things like that. So it's not what it was. It's something new. It's something. There's more trust than we ever had during the marriage. It's still not, because trust was a key word between us. It's still not where it could maybe eventually will go. But as trust is getting better, for at least for me, trust was my key word. As trust for me is getting better, so is my relationship with my ex-wife, so that we are actually able to have great conversations and things that we never really did during our marriage.
So from your own experience, you have talked about in our other conversations and alluded to today how your relationship in your marriage went through different stages as both of you were, noticing what you needed and what you were getting versus what you weren't getting, and all of those things. In other words, you began to experience inside your marriage that there was a lot going on that had a lot to do with different needs and the different ways that you
and needs is the right word.
and
I
needs,
mean,
right
and,
word.
needs the right word, which is why I would challenge that anything that it's not that we actually don't have some, by the stretch of the imagination, some aspect of unconditional love between us, because I think if it wasn't there, we would have we would in some sense, we were in a 20-year divorce,
Mm-hmm.
24-year marriage with a 20-year divorce. If there wasn't some aspect of unconditional love in there, where we just had some capacity to love each other despite all these need validation failures and all that other stuff, then we would not have even made it to 24 years. And so I actually look at our 24-year marriage as a sort of a validator for the fact that unconditional love can exist. Even in the most reprehensible conditions, it can exist. It doesn't necessarily triumph during that process, but it's there as a thread or a connector or something that allows us to keep going. But to your point, the needs was the big deal. Both of us came into the marriage and with a completely different, almost some ways mirrored, but yet still a different set of needs. Mine with my creating a picture of what was the perfect world that it needed everybody to glom onto, and having my wife as this beautiful attachment to that world, and just sort of like the picturesque aspect to what our marriage, we made our life look pretty good, or at least I made it a point to make our life look pretty good. She wasn't always along for the same ride. So my need was the appearance of perfection and beauty, the appearance of success, the appearance, so that I could get the praise and the accolades. And so she became an attachment to that process. So my needs were her to show up dutifully as that attachment. Don't violate that attachment. Don't do that. Now, the reason why I think our divorce was so successful, as if you can call a divorce successful, is because I was no longer in that need state.
Mm-hmm.
I no longer was like, oh my gosh, the marriage failed. I don't look good. I didn't have any of that language. And it was kind of interesting because I had somebody who I cared a little bit. He's a nice guy. I liked him. We were making a connection and things like that. And then when something upset him in our relationship, he goes, well, you're getting a divorce anyway. You're just nothing but a failure.
Oh, ouch.
He brought his stuff into my equation and he needed to put judgment on me, which led me to believe that one day you're going to eat those words because what I just saw in you And there's no judgment. I was just more at a discernation. You're going to be in my shoes one day because of that exact voice you just gave me. Because marriage's failure or not failure is not dependent on just holding on. Although we did make it 24 years. It had everything to do with the fact that we were both learning in those 24 years. And when it came time for the divorce, we both knew it was the right thing. That we, in the place where I was no longer caught up in the appearance of things. And in a place where she needed to have somebody who had not broken that validation step for 24 years. I could no longer, even if I, flipped on a dime and was able to just nurture. It was just too much, too long, too much. So, and her new man is there for her at every second. Like if he's the perfect partner for her right now, and maybe forever, but when she needs something, he does it. And I was not that guy.
Yeah. I mean, listen, here's the difference. It doesn't mean that we don't have needs. It doesn't mean that we don't have preferences. It doesn't mean that we don't have differences that could make a very big difference in being able to coexist peacefully and effectively with each other. Mm-hmm. But there's a big difference between that and judgment leading to blame and conflict and abuse.
We had that though.
Right. But what I'm saying is that two people can make the decision and make the observation, living together is probably not working too well for us. And it's not, and I love you, but look, I can't live with you, so that you can still have love and even unconditional love and still decide not to maintain a life together. But it doesn't have to be acrimonious. It doesn't have to be based on judgment or calling the other person horrible names, or they're a bad person, therefore I don't want anything to do with you, that kind of thing. So, a lot of people misunderstand, discovering that maybe we don't live well together and we best part our ways, but you can still have, as you said, you alluded to, but still have love and unconditional love. But unconditional love doesn't rule out the discernment that says, I think we best part ways. I love you. It doesn't mean I can live with you. There's a difference.
I once heard a young woman say something to her. Oh, actually, it was somebody you might even know, but I would just say when she was younger, she said to her husband, if you agree that we can part ways today, I will still love you and like you. If I have to wait one more day, that could change. And what she was really saying is that let's not hold on to something that's not working, because unconditional love was there for her as long as she didn't have to endure another day. So even though there was a little bit of a transaction to this thing, the calculus in the equation is that in order for me to unconditionally love you, we have to undo the thing that's damaging. And so she made an unconditional love contract with herself, that in order for me to not become a hateful, shrill, ugly person, I need to separate myself from this relationship as it's defined today. And apparently they're friends today, connected. They've talked periodically. The notion that one more day would have changed that equation, and that she knew enough to be her true self to say, I know the right answer here. The unconditional loving answer is for us to part ways. And that's a challenging thing. And for me, if my ex-wife had decided for us to actually firmly divorce, say 20 years ago, it would have broken me. And instead, it made me look at, as we had done some development and things like along the way, not realizing we had done it, that this was an opportunity for a fresh start, a way to do a reset, so to speak, and actually really connect, in my case, really connect to the person who I had ignored. I ignored myself in my entire life. Creating that public image, that wasn't me. I had never shown me. So now, having reconnected to myself, and I get to show, if I need to show, maybe that's not the right word, but what people see now is not the curated. Well, maybe there's always some curation where maybe some people put on makeup. I might cut my hair, those kinds of things. But for the most part, what you see in me is way more authentic. It's way more real. And it's because I'm unconditionally loving myself. I don't think I even knew I had an inkling for what that looked like even 10 years ago. I was probably scared to death to be alone because I couldn't be with myself.
Well, okay, so we get back to the source of unconditional love, according to experts like Eric Fromm.
Okay.
The source of unconditional love is yourself.
Okay.
Is your willingness to see yourself and to be seen by others to the extent that you are self-accepting, to the extent that
Which means you're taking judgment out of it.
you're taking judgment out. Exactly. So, but it all begins and ends with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so we go through different levels, perhaps throughout the decades of our life as we're growing and developing, in which we have reached another level of non-judgment with ourselves. Often it takes time to sort that out. It takes going through many ups and downs in different relationships to really sort that out. Different relationships, as I mentioned, will affect us in different ways. And the extent to which we're triggered, you see, the trigger I see is the gift. The trigger is the invitation to face yourself.
I agree with that.
Right? The trigger is that piece of us that is being told by that trigger mechanism, something is happening and I don't want to see it. Something's happening, I don't want to feel it. And then so the trigger mechanism causes us to react to the other person. We push back as if to blame them or judge them for doing this to me, rather than my owning that trigger and using that as an invitation to face myself. So that's why I say every relationship that triggers us is a gift. It doesn't mean that we have to stay in it, but we have to see it for what it is so that we're willing to not constantly judge the other person or blame the other person for what's in me being triggered.
Well, I guess I'll just add to this thing just from my own personal experience is that one of the transformative moments was when I realized how much what I needed to feel whole depended on other people. Yes. Once I had made that awareness, and that may be my awakening maybe happened in that instant. The truest aspect of my awakening was, oh my gosh, I can't take care of myself. I need others to do it. And it left me in another within seconds, a realization is that that's not right. That's out of alignment, that I need to nurture and take care of myself, which is when I first began to have this conversation about how do I do that? I've never done it. It's scary as all get out. In fact, I don't even like this guy, the guy that was there before. Don't even like him. Maybe somebody else I had talked to told me I loathe the inner guy. Perhaps that's the word. So if you don't like that person, how do you spend time with that person to discover or reveal these aspects of unconditional love? Now, I could share my journey. I would love to have you talk about what that looks like for anybody who's going through this process. When you suddenly discover you've been trying to fill holes with other people instead of with yourself. That's the unconditional love equation, right?
It is. And to the extent that I needed to fill that emptiness with specific people, like, in other words, I wanted to have lots of children. I didn't. I have a surrogate number of surrogate children, but I never had another child to fill that empty place. And what I understood about that emptiness was that the emptiness was about my need to nurture. And that also included nurturing myself.
Ooh, that's the crux of it, right?
That's the crux of it.
Like nurture is a loop. So in order to nurture others, we need to nurture ourselves. Yet in order for us to properly nurture ourselves, we must nurture others.
So so it keeps circling around, right?
Okay.
So, and that was an unfolding process for me, as it is for everybody.
So it's possible that early training ground for unconditional love is having pets. An early training ground for unconditional love is your own children. Although, would it be fair to say that because of the fact that we keep expectations on our children, that we end up creating conditional love in the process?
That's the problem. So the the problem is that if we've been conditioned in a particular way to think that in order to be a successful parent, our children have to do blah, 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 or be blah, 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 we're constantly going to be in that ego place, and we're not going to go to the heart place. We're going to constantly be in that judgmental place and not in that unconditional love place. So in other words, all judgment is, about blaming and judging and creating separateness, right? It's always about seeing ourselves separate from the other, distinct from the other, judging either them or ourselves in one way or another.
Right. So judging is that wall.
It's a wall. And part of what unconditional love is about, where it begins and ends with me, begins and ends within you, right, is about recognizing that you are me and I am you.
Back to the loop.
Back to the loop.
Back to the loop. So I'm, the course of my work is I simplify my work by describing it about helping people reveal their authentic stories and releasing those stories that don't belong to them. And in some ways, like during the course of this latter part of our discussion here, it's like I was looking at this from the ideas that in many cases, parental expectations are the stories that are heaped on us that technically don't belong to us, yet we live by them. Mm-hmm. And then in order to actually reveal our authentic story, which now I have learned is really that involves that unconditional love component, that once we are leaning in on unconditional love, and we are now primed and ready to reveal the rest of the bloom of who we are, the power of who we are, the truth of who we are, and our ability to even trust who we are is utterly dependent on releasing those old stories. So what we've really been talking about here, in my estimation, in this talking about unconditional love, is that it's always there waiting to be revealed. Yet life throws all these things at us that become interrupters, delayers, obstacles, speed bumps, whatever one you want to put that phrase on there. And for often limiting our beliefs and trapping us in emotions that don't serve us.
Exactly. So when it's always waiting to be revealed, I would add to that, we are here to be revealed. In other words, each human being is here to be the most we are designed to be. It's always an unfolding process and ever expanding process. And to the extent that we are in relationships that are filled with conditional love, meaning judgment and blame and expectations and all these limitations and limiting beliefs and everything, we are prevented and thwarted from being who we are designed to be. And as Eric Fromm says, love is an attitude. It's not about a person.
You've simplified it right there. Love is an attitude. True love is an attitude.
True love is an attitude. And it's about being totally present to that attitude. In other words, it's about being aware. I'm here to be me and to share me. And it's not about what you expect of me. It's about what I allow myself to be with you. And if you don't want that, okay, you're lost.
Okay. So how about, first of all, I would love to have you come on my show to talk about this very same subject.
That's a deal.
Okay. Second thing is I think maybe this is an interesting sign off for our show here that we've done, is for me to tell you that without a steak dinner, even though that's what we had on Wednesday night, and I thank you for that, that with everything that we are and have become in terms of friends and all those other things, the most valuable piece to this entire journey with you and is for me able to say, I love you, Sheila, and know that there is nothing I'm asking for in return. And it just makes me feel good.
Beautifully said. And likewise, Brian, I love you. And there's no expectation, there's no agenda, there's no judgment, there's no catch, there's no, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. We have reestablished our friendship on a deeper level just this year, in which I think we've both been experiencing and exhibiting what that free flow of sharing is all about, without expectation, without a quid pro quo, without you do this for me, I'll do this for you. It's been a free exchange. And
it has been. Thank you, COVID.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, what's anything is that maybe COVID has created, and I'm just going to be extemporaneous here. Maybe COVID has created an environment where people can start to say, we can't do the same old anymore. And maybe this unconditional love discussion is more ripe for people than has historically been true. I think one of the biggest challenges is that people will, whether it's a biblical proportion discussion about love, or it's, a spiritual journey, or whatever the case may be. One of the things I've noticed is that there are people who will talk about love, even unconditional love, and I'm sure I have some cases where this has been true about myself too. Yet we can show up as very incompassionate and unkind, and under the certain conditions with perhaps it's you're not thinking the right way in my estimation. I'm judging, right? Or whatever the case may be, and therefore I need to put you in that other category. And so it's given me pause. COVID has given me pause for going like, well, part of the human condition is fear or scared. And if I can be loving towards somebody who's showing up scared, which means there's a lot of ugliness, anger, rage, judgment, accusation, whatever the case may be, and I can say, I still love you. That doesn't even have to be verbal. I can just send it out to the universe. And there are people in politics, without naming names, because I don't want to get involved in a political discussion here, where I've actually said, I love you, recognizing the scared little child deep down inside that is fomenting the very behavior that I actually personally find repulsive and I could be easily judgmental about. Yet if I look past that behavior and realize that the person inside is suffering, and not the reason for my unconditional love, but allows me to understand that even if they are shown up in the worst way, I can still love them.
Exactly. So that doesn't mean we don't have preferences. That doesn't mean we don't have discernment. That doesn't mean that we don't have opinions that we consider to be valid and cogent for us. That doesn't mean that we don't have rules and consequences for our children. It doesn't mean that we don't have rules and consequences for our society. It does mean that judgment doesn't have to enter the picture. Discernment can. And it also means that we don't have to blame. So when we can replace judgment with compassion, just like you referenced with people that may not think the way you want them to think, or you don't like their ideas or whatever, and when their behavior is something that we don't like, we can go to compassion. And it doesn't mean we don't have boundaries. It doesn't mean we aren't able to respect ourselves and to be self-protective of certain things that might be dangerous. All of that is another layer, but judgment doesn't have to have the final vote. Compassion can.
I love that. Replace judgment with compassion.
So why don't we conclude on that note for this part of our conversation? Because obviously it's a very big conversation. And, I'll invite you back for part 2 of this one. Here, you can continue to interview me if you want to.
Oh, I loved it. I hope you liked it.
and I did, and I'll look forward to being on your show for this conversation as well. And and so thank you, Brian, for being a part of this important conversation in which we're talking about making love better. Is it possible to love unconditionally? Of course, it's possible, and that's one thing that we can add to our repertoire in making love better. So until next time, this is Sheila Pearl, the Love Doctor, saying, make love better in your life. Bye for now. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Sheila.